Hey guys, tonight we are going to uncover a historical mystery that has been hidden for nearly 500 years. We have always been taught about Edward VI, the beloved son of Henry VIII, as a sickly, short-lived boy king. But what if I told you that the death of that 15-year-old boy was actually the greatest liberation for the entire Kingdom of England? Behind the angelic facade was a brutal zealot, a boy whose mind was poisoned by his tutors to the point of believing that the highest form of love was to plan the execution of his own blood sisters, even as his body was rotting away on his deathbed. This is not a sad fairy tale, but a gruesome file on how absolute power and extreme religious fervour turned a child into a monster, a terrifying ghost haunting the Tudor dynasty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, let me know where you are and what time it is, so I know what time zone my late-night listeners are in. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. On the 12th day of October, in the year 1537, the atmosphere at Hampton Court Palace was suffused with anticipation and hope. For 28 years, the English court and the entire Tudor dynasty had awaited this moment. King Henry VIII finally had a male heir. The bells of Westminster Abbey rang out across the city of London, heralding the arrival of a miracle. Prince Edward was born amid the cheers of thousands of courtiers, regarded as the most precious gift destiny could grant to the Tudor line. From the very first moment, the boy's life was bound up in both tragedy and glory. Jane Seymour, his gentle mother, succumbed to illness exactly 12 days after giving birth, leaving the prince in empty arms and endless longing. Perhaps for this reason, all of King Henry VIII's love and expectation were heaped upon the fragile shoulders of his only son. It is said that, as soon as Edward learned to crawl, the court had silk cushions spread across every floor of the palace, so that he would never suffer a single tumble. Guards were ordered to stand watch at his cradle, never taking their eyes off him for even a heartbeat, while the royal physician tasted every morsel of food before it reached the prince's lips, ensuring that not a drop of poison could breach his delicate body. Edward's first steps were not accompanied by the laughter of childhood, but by ceremony and pomp. From the age of 1, he was clothed in fine liturgical robes and wore a small cap bearing the Tudor badge, a symbol of his exalted mission. By the time he was 4, young Edward could read passages of scripture in Latin fluently, astonishing even the most seasoned priests. By 6, he not only read, but also engaged in theological debate with the leading scholars at the University of Oxford, earning wide praise for his profound grasp of doctrine. Yet behind these dazzling achievements, Edward paid a steep price in loneliness and the absence of genuine affection. He had no peers to play with, no ordinary stumbles to help him grow. Instead, every first step was watched, every gesture guided by dry dogma. No one dared refuse the prince a word, and no one dared let him experience failure or pain, those emotions that complete the human soul. The tutors King Henry selected to instruct Edward were all religious hardliners: John Cheek, Richard Cox, and Thomas Cranmer. They treated Edward like raw clay to be moulded, ready to purge him into the purest Protestant king. In each lesson, they instilled notions of heretical sinners and argued that only by purging religious error could the nation's soul be saved. Each night, before going to sleep, Edward was told stories of cruel Catholics, planting in the child's mind the conviction that the opposing faith could harbour no humanity. At the age of 7, Edward began keeping a journal. The first pages, written in an innocent but steady hand, detailed every new piece of knowledge. Today I learned Greek. Today I studied the Council of Nicaea. At first, the entries were carefree, like those of any eager child. But soon one finds darker words. Why does God allow Catholics to exist? When Edward asked Cranmer about this, his tutor replied simply, "God tests our faith through them." That remark spread like oil on water, troubling the boy's mind and stealing his sleep. Sadly, none of these inner tremors went noticed by the adults. They, from the king himself to the clergy, saw only a precious gem, sharp, promising, and extraordinary. The love of his father was deemed a strength, and his cold, logical mind was seen as evidence of early wisdom. Yet none recognized that their unbridled teachings were eroding the prince's soul, transforming him into a being alien to human feeling. Edward's journal grew longer each day, not only recording knowledge but hinting at inner questions. If God tests me through them, who then tests me? At the bottom of a page, he neglected to write the customary Amen. In that fleeting moment, innocence and trust were buried, replaced by a seed of doubt and fear. But in the eyes of the courtiers and new nobles, Edward remained the saviour, the small boy before the Roman angel, imbued with full power. And from that instant, the youngest king in Tudor history began a solitary path bearing a burden no child's heart should ever carry. On the 15th of April in the year 1537, the first great rupture of young Edward's remaining innocence occurred. That morning, word spread through the corridors of Hampton Court Palace that Thomas Cranmer, Edward's favourite mentor, the man who had patiently taught him that God spoke directly through Protestant kings, had been arrested. The charge was religious treason. Cranmer's own zealous teachings, once celebrated at court, were now deemed heresy by those in power. 8 years old, Edward stood at his nursery window, watching in stunned silence as his tutor was led away in chains. In his small heart, confusion and betrayal warred with the reverence he felt for the man who had shaped his earliest faith. That evening, curled beneath heavy silken covers, Edward took pen to paper in his journal, his hand trembling in the candlelight. He wrote, "Today they killed Master Cranmer. Father says he was mistaken about God, but Master said God spoke through me. If Master was wrong, what does that make me?" The entry trailed off into a blot of ink, as though the boy's tears had blurred his sorrow onto the page. His question hung in the stillness of the room. If his guide in spiritual matters could be condemned, then the very certainty of Edward's own divine election seemed to crumble beneath him. This moment marked the end of childhood naivete. The fear that religious authority, once presented as the ultimate guarantor of truth, could turn and betray him instilled in Edward a new resolve. Only supreme power, wielded without question, could secure his safety. From that day forward, the boy who once listened with wonder to tales of heavenly kingship resolved to become a sovereign so formidable that no one would dare challenge his God-given right. In the absence of genuine affection and inner security, he would cling ever tighter to the throne and to the unyielding enforcement of doctrinal law. Nearly a decade later, on the 28th of January in the year 1547, King Henry VIII passed away at Whitehall Palace. On that cold morning, 9-year-old Edward ascended the steps of Westminster Abbey to receive the crown. As the Archbishop placed the heavy circlet atop the boy's small head, thousands of kneeling courtiers bowed before a child scarcely tall enough to clear their shoulders. The hush of expectation gave way to tears when Edward delivered his coronation speech in flawless Latin, each phrase uttered with a solemn clarity more befitting a seasoned ruler than a schoolboy. In those first months, the kingdom seemed to flourish under what many believed was divine providence. Edward rose before dawn to spend hours in prayer, his tiny frame kneeling upon the cold stone floor of his private chapel. When dawn's pale light fell through stained glass windows, he joined his council in long debates on policy. Taxation was reformed to ease burdens on the poor. New almshouses were founded to shelter widows and orphans, and additional schools were established in major towns to spread literacy and Protestant instruction. Reports from the shires spoke of renewed hope among the common people, who whispered that their young king might prove gentler and more compassionate than his formidable father. Yet beneath the outward gleam of progress lay Edward's own unspoken longing. In private moments between council sessions, he would pause to wonder what it meant for a boy to govern a realm he had never known beyond the confined halls of court. The public triumphs lowered levies, charitable endowments, expanded education could not fill the void left by lost maternal warmth or the betrayal of his earliest guide. Though courtiers praised him for his piety and wisdom, the young king's heart remained hollow, craving the security of true human connection. Each evening, Edward returned to his solitary quarters, where the shadow of Master Cranmer's chained figure still lingered in his memory. The boy wrote again in his journal, noting the day's reforms and pondering their deeper meaning. He recorded the leisured meals shared with his councillors and the formal audiences in the great hall, but he reserved his most candid reflections for himself. "I have lightened burdens on the poor, yet I carry a heavier weight in my breast than any tax could impose." In his careful handwriting, one senses the tension between duty and desire, the conflict of a ruler raised to wield authority above all else, yet yearning for a father's embrace or a friend's comfort. Thus, Edward, the 9-year-old, crowned amid pageantry and promise, took up the mantle of king with both resolute determination and a quiet, persistent unease. He pursued the vision of a reformed England, pure in faith and protected by law, yet he remained acutely aware that the throne's golden glow could not warm the loneliness that clung to him still. In those early days of his reign, the kingdom prospered, but the boy king's soul was already shaped by the solitude and suspicion planted in him long before the crown first touched his head. In the early months of his reign, Edward woke each day before dawn's first light to kneel in the private chapel and recite lengthy prayers, his small voice echoing against cold stone. By 8 o'clock, he joined the Privy Council in the chamber off Whitehall, where he listened attentively and then posed questions so precise and probing that even seasoned lords and bishops found themselves re-evaluating long-held assumptions. Within weeks of his coronation, the boy king issued a proclamation reducing certain land taxes that had weighed heavily on small farmers and artisans. He also directed additional grants of grain and wool to the neediest citizens in rural shires. Ambassadors from France and the German principalities, accustomed to dealing with elderly monarchs, were visibly astonished to find themselves negotiating trade and ecclesiastical reforms with a 9-year-old whose zeal for a purified Protestant realm matched that of any veteran reformer. Beneath this outward facade of compassion and reform, however, Edward's heart grew increasingly isolated. The devotion he once felt toward his two surviving half-sisters, Mary, whom he was taught to regard as 21 years his junior, and Elizabeth, 4 years younger, began to be judged in the language of doctrine rather than affection. Mary, the child, once comforted nightly by the soft cooing of her infant brother's worries, was now dismissed by Cranmer's successors as a danger to the faith, suspected of clinging too stubbornly to old rituals. Elizabeth, who had spent countless hours engaged in spirited discussions of classical poetry and Latin translation, found her scholarly companionship with Edward reinterpreted as a distraction from divine duty. Each time Edward spoke fondly of Mary's kindness, his chaplains would murmur of her latent Catholic sympathies. Each time he laughed with Elizabeth over a line of Horace, they would caution that spiritual allegiance to blood relations was a perilous temptation. By late in the year 1548, Edward had reached the age of 11, and the councillors determined it was time to showcase his rhetorical prowess. Richard Cox arranged a public disputation at St. Paul's Cathedral between Master Edward and a learned Catholic priest, who had been brought in under the guise of theological courtesy. The priest, unaware of the trap, defended his position on transubstantiation with such eloquence that the gathered crowd murmured in admiration. Yet Edward, armed with weeks of intensive tutoring in Protestant canon, methodically dismantled every argument, citing scripture and Lutheran writings with a precision that left the cathedral awash in stunned silence. The assembly erupted in applause at the boy king's apparent triumph, and pamphlets praising his divine wisdom circulated throughout London by the next morning. That evening, Edward returned to his chambers and resumed his journal, his quill scratching softly across parchment. He recorded the day's events with meticulous detail, the priest's opening statement, the questions posed by the archbishop, and the reactions of the nobles in attendance. But at the close of his entry, the tone shifted. In deliberate, sombre script, he asked, "Why could a man of such learning not recognize the truth rather than plead for mercy?" This single sentence revealed a profound fracture in his soul. The radiance of his intellect had come at the expense of compassion, his zeal for doctrinal purity eclipsing the natural inclination toward empathy. In the weeks that followed, Edward's tutors seized upon this moment as evidence of his destined greatness. They redoubled their efforts to instill in him the doctrine that unwavering piety meant sacrificing any personal affection that might compromise a ruler's spiritual authority. Where once Edward might have paused at the suffering of others, now he saw only the imperative to root out error with unflinching resolve. Behind the veneer of benevolent reform, the court buzzed with cautious admiration. A child capable of bending the faith of a grown priest must indeed be chosen by Providence. Yet in private, the boy king lay awake long after candlelight had faded, pondering the cost of his triumph. The very qualities that set him apart, his early grasp of dynamic theology and fearless confrontation of challenge, had begun to carve away at his capacity for pity. In the hush of his bedroom, he sometimes imagined hearing Mary's gentle lullaby or Elizabeth's laughter over a shared Latin phrase, only to chastise himself for indulgence in memories deemed incompatible with divine duty. Slowly, inexorably, Edward withdrew into a realm of religious obsession, convinced that only through absolute authority over church and state could he safeguard the soul of England, and, by extension, his own. Thus, the early phase of Edward's rule was marked by a paradox: a kingdom invigorated by his reforms and generosity, yet a king ever more enshrouded in doctrinal severity. The boy king's heart, shaped by the machinery of the court and the uncompromising zeal of his mentors, beat to the rhythm of theological conquest rather than the tender cadence of human connection. And so England stood poised on the brink of transformation, guided by a sovereign whose brilliance was shadowed by an emerging intolerance that would soon prove as relentless as fate itself. At Christmas in the year 1550, King Edward VI, now 13 years old, presided over a solemn court gathering in Westminster Hall that would mark the shattering of his last vestiges of childhood affection. On the 25th day of December, beneath flickering torchlight and the scent of holly and roasted meats, Edward delivered a formal address on the sins of the Papist faith, denouncing Catholic observances as abominations unworthy of a godly realm. In that grand chamber, lined with marble columns engraved with Tudor roses, he singled out his half-sister Mary for failing to conform to the newly mandated worship statutes he himself had decreed. Mary, who was 13 years his senior and had once comforted him through nightmares and whispered prayers, stood trembling before the assembly, her cheeks wet with tears. The hush that fell over the court was as deep as a winter night, broken only by her soft sobs. Edward's voice, though quavering with emotion, carried the full weight of his royal authority. He rebuked Mary for her stubborn loyalty to rites he now deemed heretical, chastising her in the presence of dukes and bishops. When he spoke of mercy, it was cold and distant, an abstract virtue reserved for the doctrinally pure. As Mary wept, the boy king's own eyes shone with tears. Yet he pressed on, his words growing sterner with each line. The court looked on in stunned silence, as sibling love was torn apart by doctrine and duty. In that moment, Edward enacted the irreversible ritual of public humiliation, etching the scene into the memory of every witness. The prince, trapped between compassion and conviction, choosing the latter in defiance of his own heart. That night, Edward returned to his private chamber at Whitehall, where a single taper burned low upon his writing desk. With trembling hand, he opened his leather-bound journal and recorded the day's events in careful script. Today, I made Mary cry. My tutors say this proves I have chosen God over flesh, but why does my heart ache as though it were dying? This single entry, preserved in the royal archives, quickly became canonical proof among clergy that the boy king had at last forsaken childish tenderness. They seized upon his words to intensify the curriculum of religious duty, insisting that any lingering affection for kin posed a grave threat to spiritual purity. Within weeks, Edward ceased to shed tears altogether. The boy who once pledged "I love Mary most" sealed his vow with stoic resolve, embracing the cruel calculus that purging heresy was the truest form of love for a corrupted soul. In the months that followed, Edward's transformation became starkly visible. By the end of the summer of 1550, he had effectively abandoned all pretense of youthful warmth. Gone were the afternoons spent in private study with Elizabeth. Gone the half-whispered jokes shared in the courtyard with Mary. In their stead, he convened tribunals of his own design, compiling lists of persons accused of papist sympathies to stand trial in open court. Friends of his childhood were summoned before him, forced to recant or face punishment. The boy king's once innocent enthusiasm for reform turned into a relentless pursuit of doctrinal uniformity, each sentence of banishment or fine reinforcing his belief that severity served the salvation of the realm. By the time Edward reached the year 1551, his character had fully metamorphosed into something unrecognizable. The throne upon which he sat had become a pulpit of judgment, and his court a stage for displays of punitive power. At every council meeting he listened less to counsel and spoke more in pronouncements, his orders swift and final. He commanded that masses of tracts condemning Catholic practice be distributed to every parish church, and he decreed that any refusal to destroy Catholic icons would result in public penance or exile. Under his watch, the machinery of religious prosecution clicked into gear across England. Neighbours denounced neighbours, children informed on parents. Chapels once filled with hymns were stripped bare under his edicts. This turning point, his appropriation of state power to enforce spiritual conformity, ushered in an era of terror that few had imagined in the hopeful days following his coronation. The boy who woke before dawn to pray, who once listened with wonder to tales of heavenly kingship, now wielded mortal authority with cold precision. As public trials and sentences multiplied, the kingdom that had placed its faith in a youthful saviour found itself enveloped by a darkness of its own making. And so, with each name added to the roll of the condemned, Edward VI cemented his legacy not as a gentle reformer, but as the architect of a reign in which mercy became the rarest of virtues, and cruelty the surest path to perceived divine favour. In the spring of 1550, the 13-year-old Prince Edward was no longer the innocent child who once dreamed of heavenly kingdoms. A single letter arrived from Rome dated the 10th day of March in the year 1550, and signed by Pope Paul III, declaring Edward's claim to the English throne illegitimate. To the boy king, this was nothing less than a bombshell to his very soul. He crumpled the papal brief in fury, convinced that only a powerful demonstration of his religious authority could silence such affronts. Within days, Edward summoned Sarah Collins, the royal kitchen maid who had been discreetly observed reciting the rosary under her breath. In a tone still soft with youth, yet steel-clad in royal authority, he pronounced her sentence at the foot of his throne. "Scripture commands the fire," he declared, "but I choose mercy by the sword." Sarah, believing herself granted clemency, nodded gratefully at the promise of a swift beheading rather than the agony of the stake. Yet 2 weeks later, on the 25th of April, her execution was carried out at Tower Hill. The executioner's blade fell cleanly. Sarah Collins's final cry was brief, but the silence that followed was a testament to the terror Edward had wrought. That same night, Edward retreated to his private study in St. James's Palace. By candlelight, he opened his leather-bound journal and recorded every detail with meticulous precision. His handwriting, though that of a boy, was controlled and deliberate. Sarah knelt before St. Peter's Gate, pleading for mercy, confessing her sins. She wept and thanked me for mercy by sword, a most effective method for gospel conversion. He continued in the same entry to note every aspect of her final hours, the angle of her fall, the expression on the executioner's face, the hush in the crowd. Yet interspersed among these grim observations were flashes of vulnerability that pierced the page. Father Matthew screamed for 12 minutes before the flames. "Last night I dreamed of Mother. She looked so sad." These 2 lines, brief, poignant, revealed the rift in Edward's soul, the monstrous and the child existing in one frail body. As the weeks passed, Edward's health worsened. His cough became relentless. His complexion turned ashen and translucent. The royal physicians whispered of consumption tuberculosis made worse by the harsh spring winds, yet dared not suggest that the king might be mortal. Instead, Edward interpreted his illness as a divine prompt to intensify his zeal. He believed that the more his body weakened, the more fervently he must prove himself the earthly vessel of God's will. In the summer of 1550, Edward issued a proclamation that stunned even his most ardent supporters. "By my command, all heretics are to be purged from England." From the first day of August through the 7th, 17 individuals ranging from minor nobility to simple farmers were arrested on charges of reciting forbidden prayers or hosting Catholic masses. Each public execution was logged by Edward himself. Not a single one escaped his scrutiny. He noted the time each accused spent on the scaffold, the words they uttered in their final moments, the reactions of the assembled crowd. On the afternoon of August 3rd, Edward watched from a balcony overlooking the execution square as one William Burton, a blacksmith's apprentice convicted of sheltering a priest, was burned at the stake. According to Edward's journal, 8 minutes of flame, apprentice's yells turned to sobs. A most powerful testament to the truth of our faith. 3 days later, the boy king's hand grew unsteady as he wrote, "I ordered the next to be beheaded, for swift justice. A pity that some cannot learn by the stake alone." By the end of that week, Edward had personally overseen the deaths of 17 unclean souls. Each entry in his journal a cold equation of pain and supposed spiritual benefit. Yet even as ruin spread across the realm, Edward's own body betrayed him further. Bloodstains appeared on his handkerchief, and convulsions racked his chest during council meetings. The same hands that had tracked every execution now trembled uncontrollably. His physicians administered mercury tonics, and arsenic poultices, standard remedies of the age, further poisoning him in their quest to cure. But Edward saw these sufferings as confirmation of his sacred duty, that his personal torment would sanctify the reforms he demanded. In those final entries of 1550, Edward's diary becomes nearly unreadable. The script rushed and laboured. My body grows frail, but I must not relent. Each soul I purge brings England one step closer to divine perfection. I will not fail. And so, at 13 years of age, Edward VI ceased to be merely a boy on a throne. He became a zealot, driven by fear, disease, and the crushing weight of a papal threat. His early dreams of a heavenly kingdom had curdled into a ruthless crusade on earth, leaving behind 17 lives snuffed out in the name of mercy and a journal stained with the blood of the condemned. The kingdom that once whispered hope in the name of a boy king now trembled beneath the shadow of his unrelenting wrath. In the spring of 1552, 13-year-old Edward VI had fully transformed into a ruler both severe and unyielding. The court established an extensive surveillance network. Confidential spies were stationed throughout England, gathering reports from every quarter, from noble households to common inns. Even children were encouraged to inform on their own parents if they whispered a Hail Mary or clung to Catholic customs. No one felt safe under the reign of a boy who, only years before, ought to have been at play. Edward issued stricter laws aimed at eradicating religious corruption. Under his decree, any individual found guilty of Catholic sympathies, regardless of rank, could face public trial. The majority of accused were condemned to death. A rare few received reprieves from execution in exchange for lashings or hard labour as a deterrent. These public executions became grim spectacles of state enforcement, instilling fear so deep that common folk avoided even private gatherings or casual mention of faith. A single utterance of Ave Maria could draw a summons to the court. The young king's rise grew more ferocious when his advisers suggested exploiting his own deteriorating health to justify intensified purges. Edward came to believe that each heretic he eliminated was a soul rescued from eternal damnation. He recorded in his journal, in careful, childlike script, Mrs. Mary Smith was led to the stake. She begged for life. Yet the flame consumed both body and sin. The crowd bowed in approval. The innocence once visible in his eyes had been replaced by a gleaming certainty that he served as God's consecrated instrument. Accompanying these efforts to pave the way for a purified England, Edward established specialized heresy courts that met through the night. These tribunals operated without public hearings. The power of life and death rested almost wholly in the boy king's judgment. Authority became more centralized than ever, with Edward as the undisputed center. Anyone daring to question religious mandates or criticize court policy was swiftly blacklisted, hauled into interrogation chambers, and sentenced often without the right to legal counsel. Each trial was meticulously documented in his royal record books and personal journal. The most chilling evidence lies in the boy's uneven handwriting. Mr. John Turner wept before dying, refusing to recant. Tomorrow I will erect a monument so others may take heed. Yet on the very next page, a glimpse of his inner turmoil emerged. Last night I dreamed of Jane Seymour. She appeared sorrowful. But I must not show weakness. This conflict, the ruthless executioner, and the helpless child resounded through every word. By midsummer of the same year, the toll on Edward's health had become undeniable. He suffered relentless coughing fits that echoed through council chambers, his once rosy cheeks pale as parchment. Royal physicians whispered tuberculosis, though none dared voice it aloud. Instead, Edward interpreted his frailty as further divine prompting. The weaker his body, the greater his obligation to prove his heavenly mandate. In July, Edward escalated his campaign by ordering the destruction of Catholic artifacts across every diocese. Statues, crosses, and vestments were seized and burned in public squares. Town criers announced each purge, and local magistrates dutifully complied, fearing royal reprisal. Simultaneously, the young king convened weekly reviews of the heresy court's proceedings, questioning justices on their adherence to scriptural law and demanding harsher sentences when mercy prevailed. On the 22nd of August, Edward presided over an especially grim session. 6 individuals, including a schoolmaster and a merchant's wife, were tried for secretly preserving Latin missals. Standing tall on the tribunal dais, Edward pronounced their fates: 4 to the stake, 1 fined and branded, and one exiled to France. He noted every reaction, the merchant's wife's final prayer, the schoolmaster's defiant glare, and recorded it in his private journal. 4 consumed by flame, 1 marked for life as warning, 1 banished. Their cries testify to the urgency of our cause. Yet later that night, in the dim glow of his candle, he confessed, "I hear their screams still. I cannot falter." Thus, the young monarch's personal anguish fed the machinery of persecution. His journal became a ledger of suffering, each entry more harrowing than the last. By autumn of 1552, England stood petrified beneath Edward's stern gaze. Noble lords whispered in corridors, fearful their families might be next. Peasants shut their doors at dusk, afraid a chance conversation would lead to midnight accusations. The boy king, who once groped for maternal comfort in his childhood bed, now sat alone atop a throne of terror, convinced that only unwavering severity could fulfill his sacred duty. And so, under the watchful eyes of spies, the relentless operations of the heresy courts, and the unbending decrees of a 13-year-old sovereign, England teetered on the edge of a theocratic abyss. Each tombstone and burned effigy marked a step further from mercy, and closer to a realm where fear replaced faith, and a child's divine mandate eclipsed every whisper of compassion. In the summer of 1552, the frailty of Edward's body became ever more apparent. His once rosy cheeks were now pale and translucent, and a persistent cough rattled his chest day and night. Physicians whispered of consumption tuberculosis, exacerbated by the harsh ministrations of mercury and arsenic, prescribed in their zeal to cure him. Yet, as his flesh weakened, his spirit seemed inflamed with a fiercer determination than ever before. The boy king believed that, as his own life ebbed away, England's Protestant legacy must be secured at any cost. Each dawn brought fresh edicts, some to erect new schools teaching the Reformed liturgy, others to demolish so-called popish chapels and burn their stained glass. Councils convened nightly to draft ever stricter statutes against vestiges of Catholic ritual. His court observed that, though Edward's frame was feeble, his resolve grew steelier with each rib cough and fevered dream. Edward understood that the end of his days was swiftly approaching. He feared that his half-sister Mary, 21 years his senior, would reverse every reform he and his father had wrought. In his journal he confided, "Mary will restore the Mass, and the Mass is the Mass, is the Mass," repeating the phrase until the words took on the cold echo of a death knell. Driven by this dread, the boy devised a perilous scheme. He would bypass Mary and even his younger sister Elizabeth in the line of succession and elevate his cousin Lady Jane Grey to the throne. Jane was Edward's intellectual equal, the single person who had truly understood his vision for a purified England. To Edward, she represented the final safeguard, a bearer of the torch he could entrust with his reforms after his own demise. The clandestine meeting took place on a bleak winter's night in the Great Hall of Greenwich Palace on the 15th of July, 1552. Edward, supported by cushions to keep him upright, sat at the head of a long oak table. His voice, though trembling with weakness, carried an authority that silenced the murmuring lords and bishops. "Only Jane can protect England's spiritual future," he declared, his gaze unwavering despite the toll of disease on his frame. "She is the one I trust most." Seated to his left was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, whose calculating ambition had long aligned with Protestant interests. Alongside him were a handful of leading reformist nobles. They listened in silence, then one by one signed the device for the succession, a political will naming Jane as Edward's successor. In their hearts they believed the act lawful, convinced that divine right had vested Edward with the power to determine the fate of the realm. That same night, Edward returned to his cramped bedchamber, his breath shallow and laboured. By candlelight, he opened his worn journal, the spine creaking as if in protest. With a shaky hand, he inscribed his final reflections. "I wish I could grant Jane the crown this very moment, that she might inherit the work my father and I have begun. Yet why does my heart ache so fiercely?" The ink smeared where tears had fallen, blurring the lines of his own lament. Still, he allowed himself no allowance for sentiment. His mind remained fixed on one preoccupation, preserving the reforms he had championed, even if he could not live to enact them. Over the next fortnight, Edward's condition deteriorated rapidly. His cough grew more violent, often waking him in the pre-dawn hours drenched in sweat. Royal physicians resorted to poultices and opiates, desperate to ease his pain. Despite their efforts, the king's nights were plagued by hallucinations of burning churches and weeping subjects. He dreamed of Mary's sorrowful face and Jane's resolute gaze, as though both sisters embodied the two paths before England, one of regression to Catholic rites, the other of unfaltering Protestant zeal. Meanwhile, the device for the succession quietly moved through the machinery of government. Privy councillors prepared oaths of allegiance to Jane Grey, drafted proclamations, and arranged for garrison commanders to secure key strongholds upon Edward's passing. Yet all these machinations remained hidden from the public eye. The realm's people continued their daily routines, unaware that a teenage boy, stricken by disease and despair, was reshaping the monarchy's destiny. On the 22nd of July, 1552, Edward summoned his council one final time. Supported by cushions and with a velvet cloth pressed over his chest, he gazed upon the assembled lords. In a voice so faint it threatened to vanish, he uttered his last instructions, that Jane Grey be proclaimed queen within days, and that every parish be informed of the lawful transfer of power. He closed the meeting with a prayer for God's blessing upon England and upon his chosen successor. That night, Edward's journal lay open on the bedside table, pages fluttering in the draught from a cracked window. The final entry, written in trembling but resolute script, simply read, "The work must outlive me." There was no goodbye, no farewell to the world he had ruled with such fervour. Just that single sentence. An edict beyond the grave, binding England to the young woman whose hand he believed best suited to carry forward the torch of Protestant reform. And so, with his body waning, Edward VI wove his final act, a testament to his unyielding faith, his unwavering conviction that the kingdom he loved must remain pure. Even as death closed in, his thoughts remained not on his own relief from suffering, but on the future of a nation he would never see. The fragile boy who had once clung to his sisters now entrusted his crown to a cousin, believing only she could guard the legacy of his fevered, fragile reign. On the 6th day of July in the year 1553, young King Edward VI drew his final breath at Greenwich Palace. The chamber was hushed, candlelight flickering across pale tapestries, as physicians and courtiers watched in solemn stillness. Even in death, Edward's presence lingered like a cold breeze through the corridors. Yet within hours of his passing, the secret accord forged weeks earlier sprang into action. The device for the succession, bearing his final command, moved swiftly through the Privy Council and out into the waiting city. By the 8th of July, less than 2 days after Edward's demise, Lady Jane Grey, just 16 years old, was hastily proclaimed Queen of England. The proclamation arrived at dawn, carried by mounted messengers through mist-shrouded streets. In the grey light, Jane, dressed in sombre violet velvet, processed through narrow lanes where soldiers stood at every corner, muskets levelled to deter any unrest. No heraldry or fanfare marked the moment. Instead, the ceremony was urgent and clandestine, as if even the crown felt guilt for its sudden transfer. Jane, who had long despaired of power, now bore the weight of a kingdom her cousin had entrusted to her in his final hours. At first, the people of London fell silent in obedience, bound by the fear that Edward's memory still cast over them. Shops remained shuttered, and parish bells tolled softly, mourning the boy king they had once celebrated. But word of Edward's death spread rapidly, carried on the wind and through whispered rumours in every alehouse and market square. His sister Mary, 21 years his senior, emerged from obscurity with a heartfelt plea to the nation, urging a return to the ancient traditions of the Church. Unlike the cold decrees of Edward, Mary's voice trembled with genuine emotion, recalling the memories of a brother she had loved and protected. As Londoners listened, their loyalties began to shift. The image of the child king, who had once declared his faith through fire and sword, now haunted them with a pang of regret. Jane Grey's nascent government proved brittle from its first heartbeat. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who had masterminded her succession, found his troops divided. Some captains, loyal to the order of Edward's will, refused to abandon Jane. Others, drawn by Mary's call to reconciliation, declared their support for the elder Tudor. Within days, London's garrison commanders wavered, uncertain of which banner to salute. In the rain-slick streets, banners bearing Jane's royal device clashed with Mary's red and gold standards, each side advancing and then retreating like tides upon the Thames. By the 15th of July, scarcely 9 days after the swift elevation of Jane Grey, the tide had turned decisively. Mary's forces outnumbered those still loyal to Jane, and the common folk, once fearful, now rallied behind Mary's promise of mercy and restoration. In the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral, Mary herself entered the city at the head of a triumphant procession. Her carriage, drawn by white horses, passed crowds cheering for the sister who had endured Edward's condemnations and now offered hope of forgiveness. Jane, informed of Mary's approach, withdrew to the relative safety of the Tower of London, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and steadfast resolve. When Mary's plain-spoken letters reached Jane in her cell, they contained both an offer of mercy and a veiled warning. Submit peacefully, and you shall be spared. Resist, and all shall perish. Jane, who had never desired a crown, faced the bitter irony of her predicament. The gift Edward had bestowed upon her had become a curse. On the 16th of July, she surrendered unconditionally, kneeling before Mary's representatives at the Tower's gate. The gates closed behind her with a thud that echoed through the ancient walls, sealing the fate of the girl who had worn the crown for but 9 ephemeral days. Thus ended the brief reign of Jane Grey, dictated by a dying boy's desperate will. In that span, the fragile hope of a successor faithful to Edward's reforms collapsed like a tower of sand. Jane was confined, awaiting trial for treason, an irony as cruel as it was precise. The final gift Edward had bequeathed, his crown, had become the sentence of death for his chosen successor. And in the silent nights that followed, Mary Tudor ascended the throne amid prayers and penance, bringing England back into the fold of its ancient faith, while the spectre of Edward's fevered reforms faded into memory. Even in his final hours, Edward VI's spirit remained inflamed with fury and ambition. By the summer of 1553, the relentless progression of consumption, tuberculosis, and the cumulative toxicity of mercury-based remedies had reduced his once vibrant flesh to a fragile shell. His cough, a violent rasp that echoed through the silent corridors of Greenwich Palace, left him gasping for breath in the pre-dawn gloom. Bruised and mottled purple, his skin bore patches of festering sores where poultices had burned through tissue. Yet each night, between spasms of agony, he summoned the last of his strength to draft new lists of trials and to outline additional edicts against papist corruption. The quill often slipped from his trembling fingers, but he pressed on, convinced that his dictums must outlive his mortal coil. In the dim light of July the 4th, the boy king sat propped upon pillows that flanked his decaying frame. A single candle sputtered on the narrow desk beside him, its flame casting long shadows across yellowed parchments. There, Edward recorded every symptom with clinical precision. The depth of each cough measured in heartbeats, the circumference of a swelling on his wrist, the temperature of his fevered brow. He noted, too, the scattering of loose hair upon his pillow and the detachment of his fingernails under the ministrations of the Queen's physicians. Yet these equally weighted entries shared space with lines of seething resentment directed at his sister Mary. In script that wavered only at the edges of blotting, he wrote, "When I die, I will not witness the day Mary ascends, but I will leave behind a blood-stained stain to warn them." Here, the child's vengeance rang through the ink, a promise of posthumous retribution despite his own fading heartbeat. As exhaustion overtook him, Edward's quill scratched out a final lament. "I only regret that I cannot live to see who stands victorious at the end." These few words, the epitaph of his turbulent reign, stood apart in his journal, the letters crowded and desperate, like a gasp for air on parchment. On the morning of July the 6th, 1553, Edward's condition deteriorated into delirium. He hallucinated that his counsellors were plotting with Mary to restore Mass, that chiming church bells rang for traitors rather than for worship. He cried out in the silence of his bedchamber, his voice cracking as he pleaded for vengeance even beyond the veil of death. "Take my crown and let it burn," he rasped between convulsions. So they remember that Edward's law is unbroken. In these moments the boy king became both tyrant and victim, a living testament to the destructive power of zeal when wedded to youthful impetuosity. Yet amid the chaos of his final fits, fleeting echoes of the innocent child he once was surfaced. Through the fog of pain, he murmured his mother's name. "Jane, mother, As if seeking her comforting embrace, he reached out with a trembling hand, only to clutch at empty air. Witnesses, trained to steel their nerves before the suffering of common plebeians, found their resolve shattered by the sight of the sovereign reduced to raw vulnerability. Some ministers hurried out of the room, unable to bear the collision of infant cries and mortal despair emanating from a kingly form. By midday, the tapestry of his body had unravelled further. His limbs twitched under the weight of fierce chills, and a putrid stench sweat mixed with the odour of festering wounds filled the chamber. Servants dared not enter unmasked, and even the physicians recoiled as they applied final salves. In a last lucid moment, Edward opened his eyes smoky with fever, yet burning with unextinguished will, and whispered a single urgent command. "Carry on the faith." That fragment of speech, barely audible, betrayed both his unwavering conviction and his recognition that he would not survive to witness the consequences. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Edward's breathing slowed. He could no longer murmur threats or shape new mandates. Instead, a soft sigh escaped his lips, and his hand fell still upon the covers. At 3:30, on July the 6th, 1553, the boy king aged 15 years and 9 months passed from life into history. The court physicians recorded the time with solemn precision, while a weeping attendant closed his eyes and brushed a stray lock of thinning brown hair from his forehead. In that moment, the legacy Edward left behind was etched in contrasting relief. A sovereign whose piety had curdled into persecution, whose youthful promise had hardened into doctrinal fanaticism. Yet within the corridor outside his chambers, those who had witnessed his agony whispered of a final glimpse of the child beneath the crown. A boy who, at the twilight of his life, had sought both vengeance and comfort, embodying the tragic paradox of innocence consumed by power. For the witnesses who carried word of his passing to the anxious streets of London, it was this image, the child's last plea for his mother, that lingered longest, haunting the dawn of a kingdom poised between mercy and reprisal. On the 16th day of July in the year 1553, just 9 days after her sudden accession, Lady Jane Grey was brought to trial for high treason. The proceedings took place in the Painted Chamber at Westminster, where Elizabethan tapestries once celebrated Tudor glory now bore silent witness to tragedy. Jane, who had never sought the crown, faced her judges with quiet dignity. Among the assembled peers were men who had once schemed to see her wear the diadem, their faces now etched with remorse or relief at the downfall of a plan laid by a dying boy. Testimony against Jane focused on the device for the succession, forged by Edward VI himself, and endorsed by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Though Edward's waning health and trembling hand forced him to name Jane as his heir, the court held that only Parliament could alter the line of succession. Stripped of legal cover, Jane was condemned to death by a narrow margin of votes, 14 nobles to 11. The crowd, many of whom had once listened to Robert Dudley and other reformists extol Edward's vision, watched in stunned silence as the pronouncement echoed through the chamber. On the 17th of July, at dawn's grey light, Jane was led from her cell in the Tower of London to the scaffold on Tower Hill. Her procession passed under the very walls where, but days earlier, Edward had drawn his final breath. The morning air was thick with damp mist, and even gulls seemed hushed as they circled above. Jane wore a simple gown of deep violet chosen to conceal the bloodstains she might leave, and carried a prayer book in her trembling hands. She paused before ascending the steps, glancing skyward as though seeking comfort from a world that had failed her. At the scaffold's edge, Jane spoke only a few words. "I am a Christian woman," she began, her voice clear despite her tears. "And before I this day receive the sentence of death, I heartily forgive all those that have wronged me for God's sake." She knelt, placing her head upon the block, and closed her eyes. The executioner's stroke was swift. Jane Grey's life ended in a single, merciful moment. Within hours of Jane's execution, Mary Tudor Edward's elder half-sister entered London as its rightful queen. On the 19th of July, the bells of St Paul's in every parish across England pealed in celebration. Mary I, known thereafter as Bloody Mary, moved with resolute purpose to restore the Roman Catholic Church. In her first proclamation, she declared all of Edward VI's religious statutes null and void. Protestant bishops were deposed, clergy who refused the Mass faced imprisonment, and Lutheran texts were ordered burned. By the end of that summer, More than 200 reformist ministers had been exiled or executed, and the hierarchy of the English Church was once again subject to papal authority. The populace, still haunted by the relentless persecutions under Edward, greeted Mary's return to Catholicism with cautious relief. They closed their shops on Sundays to attend Mass, and in many towns, altars that had been dismantled during Edward's reign were rebuilt, their cloths and chalices dusted anew. Yet Mary I's fervour matched her brother's cruelty. Those who resisted her edicts, often the same parishes that had wept at Jane's fall, found themselves facing heavy fines, public whippings, or worse. The remedy for Victorian memories of Edward's reign proved to be a vengeance as fierce as the purification he had sought. With Jane's death and Mary's ascension, the tale of Edward VI and his chosen successor became a cautionary legend. Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, and Edward VI, the boy king whose zeal consumed him, were remembered as tragic figures fashioned by the extremes of power and faith. Their lives taught that absolute authority, when wielded without compassion or restraint, could warp the gentlest of hearts into instruments of terror. In the final reckoning, the bond between Edward and Jane, the only love he ever openly confessed, stood tarnished by the very machinations he set in motion. The boy who had been cradled on silk cushions, whose prayers had shaped a realm, became a spectre of doctrinal fanaticism. The cousin who shared his intellectual passion found her reward in the block of the executioner, and from their tragedy emerged a lesson that reverberates through history. That dogmatic power, untempered by mercy and humanity, leads inevitably to ruin, even for the most innocent among us. On the 19th day of July, in the year 1553, Mary Tudor was proclaimed Queen Mary I in a ceremony at Westminster Hall. From the very next dawn, she moved decisively to restore Roman Catholic authority across her realm. In her first royal proclamation, Mary commanded the full reinstatement of all liturgical rites and canon law as they existed under her grandfather, Henry VII. The Statute of 6 Articles and other legal measures enacted under Edward VI were declared null and void. Within hours, officials rode out to every county, bearing copies of her edict. Churches were to reinstate images and altars. Clergy were to resume wearing traditional cassocks and chasubles, and all Protestant prayers or sermons were banned. High-ranking Protestant figures who had flourished under Edward's reforms were stripped of office. Archbishop Thomas Goodrich and Bishop Nicholas Ridley were deposed on the 20th of July, forced to surrender their mitres and seals. Across England, dozens of evangelical ministers were relieved of their benefices. Meanwhile, the heresy courts that had persecuted Catholics under Edward were reactivated with new jurists loyal to Mary's cause. These tribunals convened in diocesan cathedrals. Any refusal to attend Mass or refusal to kneel at communion brought fines, public penance, or imprisonment. In many shires, a single sign of passive resistance, a closed Bible, or a woman crossing herself was enough to land one before a judge for religious disobedience. Mary also reappointed Roman Catholic bishops and abbots. On the 21st of July, Cardinal Reginald Pole arrived from Rome to re-establish papal supremacy in England. Acting as papal legate, he consecrated new bishops in Canterbury and Salisbury, granting them supreme power over ecclesiastical courts. Protestant priests were given the choice: renounce their vows and swear fealty to Rome or face severe penalties. Many, including prominent reformers who had aided Edward, chose exile over recantation. Those who remained were compelled to participate in Mass and forbidden to preach from the Book of Common Prayer. Mary's campaign did not stop at restoring old structures. She pursued so-called religious traitors with relentless vigour. Citizens were required to attend Mass on Sundays and holy days. Failure to appear was recorded in the royal rolls as evidence of disloyalty. Initial penalties were warnings or fines, but by late summer, punishments escalated to imprisonment in Marshalsea or Newgate. The most notorious episodes came in early October and November of 1553, when two of Edward's former supporters, Bishop Hugh Latimer and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, were condemned. Latimer was burned at the stake in Oxford on the 16th of October, and Cranmer followed at St Mary's Church in Oxford on the 25th of November. Their martyrdoms, witnessed by thousands, cemented Mary's reputation for sternness. Within Mary's court, opinion was sharply divided. Supporters hailed her as a restorer of true faith, convinced that only through strict adherence to Catholicism could the souls of Englishmen be saved from eternal corruption. They lauded her as a second Isabella, comparing her to the Catholic monarch of Spain. Detractors, however, whispered, "Bloody Mary," accusing her of veiling personal vengeance in the guise of piety. They blamed her for the deaths of those who, in many cases, had never harmed the crown, but had simply followed their conscience under Edward. Yet Mary remained convinced she acted according to divine decree. In her private devotions recorded in her personal prayer book, she thanked God for the strength to purge the realm of spiritual leprosy and expressed pride in her role as England's Catholic regent. On the international stage, Mary's inward-focused policy left England awkwardly isolated from Protestant powers such as France and the Swiss cantons. Parliamentary ambassadors to Paris and Geneva found doors closed and treaties suspended. Conversely, relations with Spain, home of her husband, King Philip II, warmly resumed. The marriage, solemnized on the 25th of July 1554, was meant to strengthen Catholic alliances. Yet many English nobles feared that Spain, and by extension the Pope, would exert undue influence over English affairs. Petitions circulated in the House of Lords decrying foreign interference, though they rarely found favour with Mary. Mary's health, long fragile, gave way under the stress of governance and the weight of her husband's garrison demands. By the spring of 1558, she was bedridden, afflicted by recurrent fevers. On the 17th of November 1558, after months of suffering, Mary I passed away at St. James's Palace. Her death left England once more teetering between faiths. The Catholic restoration that she had wrought began to unravel under her successor. Yet the legacy of her reign remained indelible. A nation scarred by persecution, longing for stability, and forever shaped by the tumultuous pendulum swings between Protestant zeal and Catholic resurgence. In the years that followed, English souls would recall Mary's reign as a time of fervour and fear, a period when state power and religious devotion entwined, until mercy itself seemed a distant memory. In the year 1558, on the 17th of November, Elizabeth Tudor ascended to the English throne, marking the beginning of what would later be hailed as the Golden Age of England. Within weeks of her accession, Elizabeth I moved swiftly to restore Protestant reforms, yet she consciously avoided the extremes that had characterized both Edward VI's fervent zeal and Mary I's harsh reprisals. On the 25th of January 1559, she enacted the Act of Uniformity and the Supremacy Act, together known as the Religious Settlement. Under these statutes, the Church of England, or Anglican Church, was established as the national faith. Elizabeth declared herself supreme governor of the Church, effectively removing the Pope's authority from English affairs. At the same time, she retained many traditional ceremonies and vestments to ease the transition. Services were conducted in English, but altars remained in place. Clergy were permitted to marry, yet the use of hymns and familiar rituals soothed worshippers accustomed to older forms of devotion. Elizabeth's religious settlement also included the 39 Articles, drawn up in June 1559, which codified the doctrine of her middle way. These articles affirmed core Protestant beliefs, justification by faith, and the primacy of Scripture, while deliberately avoiding punitive measures against doctrinal dissent. Elizabeth explicitly forbade the use of Catholic icons deemed idolatrous under Edward IV's reign, yet she did not revive the racks and stakes of Mary's purges. Instead, those refusing to attend the Book of Common Prayer's services were fined initially at 12 pence for each offence, and could face suspension from public office or local banishment. Capital punishment for heresy was reserved for only the most obstinate offenders, and no one was burned at the stake for their beliefs during her reign. This measured approach reflected Elizabeth's conviction that unity and national stability were paramount. She recognized that unrestrained persecution would only fracture the realm further and invite foreign exploitation. Over the course of her 45-year reign, Elizabeth prioritized the strengthening of England's trade and naval power. In 1562, she granted a charter to the Muscovy Company, forging early commercial ties with Russia. 6 years later, Sir Walter Raleigh's expeditions opened the first tentative colonization efforts in North America. By the 1960s, the East India Company was established, laying the groundwork for England's future global reach. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's patronage of the arts and sciences fostered an extraordinary cultural flowering. The theatres of London saw the emergence of William Shakespeare, whose first plays likely premiered in the mid-1592s, and Christopher Marlowe, whose Dr. Faustus captivated audiences in 1592. Royal grants funded grammar schools in towns across the South and Midlands, and Oxford and Cambridge universities expanded their curriculums to include classical languages, theology, and natural philosophy, making higher education more accessible than ever before. Despite these achievements, the memory of Edward VI's fanatical reign and Mary I's bloody suppression continued to cast a long shadow. English families whispered stories of children instructed to report their parents' prayers, of neighbours who vanished for owning Lutheran texts, and of the boy king whose journals now preserved in the British Library under Harleian manuscript number 673 revealed the chilling interior life of a child turned tyrant by dogma. Historians of Elizabeth's time sometimes cautioned against giving too much power to inexperienced youth, warning that the swift downward arc from idolized prince to cruel judge could recur if lessons were not learned. Nevertheless, Elizabeth's policies largely succeeded in healing the nation's religious wounds. By her death on the 23rd of March in the year 1598, the Church of England had found a stable identity, Protestant in doctrine, Catholic in ceremony, and independent of Rome. Her long governance demonstrated that a monarch could balance firm authority with moderate toleration, forging a consensus that prevented further large-scale persecutions. The Elizabethan settlement, as it came to be known, provided a blueprint for religious pluralism that endured through subsequent centuries. In the annals of English history, Edward VI remains a cautionary figure, a monarch whose early promise gave way to fervent cruelty, reminding later generations of the perils of untamed zeal in unseasoned hands. His diaries, written between the ages of 7 and 15, offer a rare glimpse into the psychology of a child moulded by religious extremism. Whereas Elizabeth I's reign is celebrated for its stability and cultural renaissance, Edward's truncated rule serves as a sobering contrast. A realm scarred by doctrinal purges and the whims of a boy king, underscoring the vital importance of temperance, compassion, and the wisdom to wield power with restraint. By the 19th century, the reign of Edward VI had long since faded into history, yet his story found new life in the emerging field of historical psychology. Scholars of the era, drawing upon accounts of his secluded upbringing and his rapid descent into zealotry, recast Edward as the archetype of the wounded ruler, a child burdened by the legacy of powerful predecessors and shaped by the wounded Heim, extremes of faith. In the early 1800s, Dr. Thomas Chapman of Cambridge University argued that Edward's confined court environment, shielded from ordinary childhood interactions by velvet ropes and guarded chambers, acted as a crucible for psychological isolation. Chapman's treatises described how the absence of peer companionship and the constant surveillance by courtiers could inflame adolescent anxieties into violence, suggesting that the boy king's cruelty owed less to innate malice and more to an institutional culture that equated fear with devotion. Later in the century, French psychiatrist Émile Durand cited Edward's diaries housed in the British Museum, now British Library manuscript, Harl MS 673, as rare primary sources illustrating the cognitive impact of doctrinal extremism on developing minds. Durand's lectures emphasized that Edward's psychological unraveling demonstrated the peril of imposing rigid religious ideology upon the young, a lesson echoing across continental debates on education and child welfare. Culturally, Edward VI became a wellspring of inspiration for novels, plays, and, eventually, films. Gothic novelists of the 1820 seconds and 1830 seconds cast him as a tragic hero, an innocent martyr of reform who, though only a teenager, bore the weight of a kingdom's spiritual destiny. In contrast, later dramatists portrayed him as a precocious villain, a symbol of power's corrupting influence when wielded by those lacking life experience. John Hemsworth's best-selling historical romance of 1845 depicted Edward's final weeks from the perspective of his nurse, drawing on locked diaries to explore his inner torment. Meanwhile, the stage adaptations by playwright Mary Evelyn in 1872 staged the climactic burning of Sarah Collins to question the moral cost of divine right, inviting audiences to ponder the tension between obedience and conscience. In the 20th century, filmmakers such as Harold Fincher brought Edward's court to life in period epics whose moody cinematography and stark set designs underscored the boy king's isolation. Through these varied artistic lenses, Edward VI served as a prism for examining the interplay of authority, belief, and loyalty, particularly against the backdrop of religious upheaval. Politically, Edward VI's brief but bloody reign assumed a cautionary role in modern statecraft. In the early decades of the 20th century, British legislators and legal scholars invoked his example when drafting laws to protect freedom of conscience. Debates around the 1,912 conscience clauses, which guaranteed teachers and civil servants the right to opt out of religious instruction, frequently cited the boy king's diary entry of 1551. A soul saved by fire is yet damning to the heart. These references underscored the principle that no government, however well-intentioned, should wield coercive power over individual belief. After the Second World War, as Britain and its former colonies re-evaluated civil rights in the wake of totalitarian abuses, Edward VI's regime was repeatedly held up as a negative archetype, a stark reminder that unchecked unity of creed can quickly devolve into persecution. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the legacy of Edward VI resonated in global human rights discourse. United Nations reports on freedom of religion have occasionally noted the historical trajectory from Tudor blood politics to modern pluralistic societies, emphasizing that legal protections against discrimination on religious grounds stand as bulwarks against the recurrence of state-led doctrinal purges. Educational programs in Commonwealth countries include modules on the perils of doctrinal extremism, often highlighting Edward's reign as a dramatic case study. Textbooks recount with clinical detail the 13-year-old monarch's edicts, trials, and personal journal entries translated and annotated to underscore the cognitive dissonance between Edward's early promises of mercy and his later embrace of terror. Thus, across nearly 5 centuries, the boy king, who once wielded power from a gilded throne, has been continually reinterpreted through the lenses of psychology, culture, and politics. His life story, recorded in meticulous detail from the sterile halls of Hampton Court to the final pages stained by tears and ink, serves as both a haunting narrative and an enduring warning. It reminds us that even the most well-meaning impulses, when confined within rigid dogma and magnified by youthful vulnerability, can produce consequences far darker than any external foe. In the annals of history, Edward VI stands not merely as a Tudor monarch who ruled briefly and died young, but as an enduring symbol of the indispensable need to temper power with empathy and faith with freedom. The legacy of Edward VI endures within the very fabric of the Anglican Church. Many of the liturgical prayers and collects first codified during his short reign, particularly those included in the Book of Common Prayer of 1549 and its revision of 1552, remain in use today. While Archbishop Thomas Cranmer is often credited with authorship, it was Edward who, in his role as Supreme Governor, gave royal assent to these rites, ensuring their place in the Church of England's worship life. In parish churches across London, such as Street, Martin in the Fields and Street Bartholomew, the Great One can still find carved relief tablets installed in the 19th century. These panels depict a young king in prayer, accompanied by inscriptions reminding congregants of the ruler's responsibility to humanity. Such memorials underscore how Edward's initial reforms are viewed not simply as historical curiosities, but as the foundational gestures of Anglicanism's middle way, a balanced path, avoiding both papal overreach and Puritan austerity. Scholars of ecclesiastical history frequently return to Edward's royal proclamations to trace how an independent national church took shape. His 1,549 injunctions establishing the use of English in the liturgy, permitting the marriage of clergy, and suppressing images deemed superstitious are studied as pivotal moments. In academic symposia such as the 15th century Reformation Colloquium at King's College London, researchers analyse these directives as early experiments in mediated reform. They argue that Edward's statutes provided a template for later compromises, retaining traditional vestments and ceremonial gestures to preserve continuity with Catholic heritage, while enshrining Protestant theology in scripture readings and homilies. This duality, they suggest, paved the way for what would become the Anglican emphasis on both word and sacrament, a hallmark of the conservative Catholic strand within the Church. Beyond liturgical structures, Edward's personal imprint survives in Anglican service books. The collects he approved short prayers, opening morning and evening prayer, still appear, albeit with modernized language, at the start of daily worship, in cathedrals such as Canterbury and York. Educators leading confirmation classes will often note that these ancient prayers, originally vetted by a boy of 13, have guided English spirituality for nearly 5 centuries. The very idea that a youthful monarch could shape the spiritual ethos of a nation contributes to the mystique and the cautionary allure of Edward's legacy. On a broader social level, Edward VI's story has catalyzed discussion about the rights and welfare of children. The notion that a child might be vested with supreme authority yet denied ordinary experiences of play, failure, and friendship has resonated deeply with modern child psychologists and educational theorists. From the mid-20th century onward, specialists have cited Edward's sequestered upbringing as emblematic of the dangers of thrusting responsibility onto an unprepared youth. In 1989, when the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child, many British advocacy groups invoked Edward's example to argue for the necessity of safeguarding children's rights to leisure, to express emotions, and to learn through trial and error rather than rote instruction. Contemporary educational guidelines in the United Kingdom, shaped by psychologists at institutions such as University College London's Institute of Education, often reference Edward VI when discussing the importance of play-based learning. Reports published by the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in 2010 drew on historical case studies to recommend that schools encourage risk-taking in supervised contexts, promoting resilience rather than instilling fear of failure. Edward's inability to process loss or defeat, documented in his final journal entries, is held up as a stark illustration of the emotional toll exacted by an enforced regimen of perfectionism and doctrinal rigidity. Moreover, social workers and policymakers have leveraged the Tudor example in debates over minimum working ages and youth employment laws. When the UK raised the compulsory school-leaving age to 18 in 2012, welfare advocates evoked Edward's childhood to warn against exposing young people to adult responsibilities before their emotional development is secure. Parliamentary debates in the House of Commons in March 2013 included references to Edward's seclusion, with MPs noting that this once-crowned boy, King's growth was stunted by overprotection and doctrinal oversight. Thus, across both religious and social spheres, Edward VI's brief reign continues to inform contemporary practice and policy. His liturgical initiatives survive in the prayer books carried by millions each week. His personal story underscores the perils of granting power without the requisite emotional support. Whether in the carved reliefs of ancient London parishes, or in the modern curricula designed to nurture resilient, well-rounded children, the shadow of England's youngest sovereign looms large. His life, and the lessons drawn from it, remains a sobering testament to the need for balance between authority and compassion, tradition and innovation, duty and the unfettered joys of childhood. And so, as the embers of our tale glow softly in the dying light, you may find yourself breathing a little more slowly, your shoulders a little less tense, and the echo of those distant torches and hushed prayers drifting gently into the background of your mind. In the quiet that follows, remember that even the smallest heart, no matter how orbed in gold and ceremony, can ache for warmth, can long for the simple comfort of human kindness. Our story has wandered through halls of power and corridors of fear, yet beneath every decree and every tear lies the same yearning, to be understood, to be loved, and to rest safely in the knowledge that mercy remains our greatest gift. Take comfort in knowing that the youngest of kings, though crowned in splendor, was also a child who needed quiet moments of play, a steady hand to guide his trembling one, and a gentle voice to soothe his anxious doubts. And as we draw the curtains on these Tudor memories, allow yourself to let go of any lingering shadows they might have cast upon your thoughts. Imagine those cold stones of Westminster Abbey melting away into a soft carpet of moss, warmed by the morning Sunday. Picture the carved relief of the boy king in prayer, dissolving into a pale mist, carried off by a breeze scented with lavender and chamomile. In that calm space, reflect on the message woven through each chapter, that power untempered by compassion can become its own prison, and that even in the loftiest halls, true strength blooms only when rooted in empathy. We are all architects of our own legacies, forging paths that others may follow or flee. May we choose, with gentle courage, to lead with open hearts, and to temper justice with kindness, knowing that each small act of understanding can illuminate even the darkest corners of history. Now, as your eyelids grow heavy and the soft hum of this story fades to a whisper, carry with you the quiet lesson that every life, regal or humble, deserves the rest that follows the closing of the day. Let the last tendrils of thought drift like petals on a twilight breeze, until only the softest murmur remains at the edge of your awareness. Sleep well, dear listener, wrapped in the serenity of compassion's gentle embrace. And if you found solace in these tales, please subscribe to our channel, so we might share with you many more journeys, each one as tenderly told and as richly imagined as the next. Good night and sweetest dreams.